Have you ever used a walkthrough, a strategy guide, or a build guide to help you get through a long game, find some secrets, or maybe compete with other players? My assumption is that you have, partially because they're a little bit unavoidable now. But I'm wondering how much you engaged with that sort of thing and from what perspective. So, for me, I grew up playing games like big JRPGs and using walkthroughs like Prima strategy guides to get through the game, find secrets, not miss things, so on and so on. I didn't use them a ton, but I do remember using them. And there's something distinctive about that era of guides. One element of it is that they're wildly inaccurate. Absolutely amazing how inaccurate they are. It was fascinating because it was like, this is the official strategy guide. You knew if you were getting the official strategy guide that you were getting the least accurate strategy guide in existence, because it was released before the game was released, or it was finalized before the game was released so that it could release at the same time as the game. So there are changes in the game that are not reflected in the strategy guide so consistently. I ran into this so many times as a kid. I was always like, how are these so wrong? This is the official guide. What's going on here? But I digress. This whole idea that I want to talk about, this strategy guide concept, the whole thing of following a strategy guide, did it remove some of the fun for you? Did you ever have that feeling while you were following a strategy guide of like, I'm just following this thing. I'm not experiencing this game. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable. I kind of feel like I'm cheating. Something's just off about this, right? And the like full on walkthroughs can feel that way. And I feel like there are guides that we kind of have to use now, right? There's a different angle, which is like, this guide explains to you how these 27 different mechanics interact in weird, subtle ways that you would never think of in this extremely complicated spreadsheet simulator of a space game. I've not played EVE Online, but that is what I'm trying to reference. There's all of these different complicated games that require some level of guidance, which is fine, but I really want to explore how strategy guides impact the way that we play games, and I want to explore a different angle of this, which is the game development strategy guides. There's this concept of tutorial hell that people talk about, getting stuck in this loop of endless tutorials. I'd like to suggest that a lot of the how-to stuff that we interact with is essentially a bad old Prima strategy guide. And there's value in it, but you kind of have to know how to extract that value. Before we dive into the development side of things, let's just talk about some games and their strategy guides. I want you to kind of keep an eye out, keep your mind open, thinking about connections between this and development, and you'll probably come up with some stuff that I'm not going to come up with. I'll try to call out some connections explicitly later in the episode. So first off, when you started following a walkthrough, or at least when I followed a walkthrough, how did you digest it? Because for me, it was line by line. It was step by step. If I was following the walkthrough, I was looking at it, and I was going, okay, where do I go now? If it was telling me take 3 steps left, 1 step up, 2 steps right, and 2 more steps forward, I would just do it, right? I was just following exactly what it said. I wasn't putting much thought into it. I was going, okay, this is how I find all the secrets. They know something I don't know, so I better follow it line by line, step by step. But, and I just want to point this out, if you would ask me to go reproduce all that stuff, I would have no idea. I would just have to pull out the guide and do it again. Little connection to game dev tutorials, but we're not going to dig into that yet. And then there's a problem with this, which was that a lot of the official guides were just wrong. So they would tell you to do something and it was just incorrect. And then the community guides would call out the issues in the official guide, which was great. Tangent, did you print out any of these old GameFAQs community guides, like on the family printer? This is only going to click for a very specific subsection of listeners, I would imagine. If you're younger, you've probably never had this experience, but I definitely found the GameFAQs guide to like a JRPG. It is like 100+ page guide. You can still find these guides online, by the way. You can dig deep into like the old greatest of old time. They've always got ASCII art in them. They're incredible. They're ridiculous. They've got maps drawn with ASCII art. It's so cool. And I'm such a little geek for it. I got so much nostalgia for this. We would print out these guides and just ruin the family printer. Just go through like 150 sheets of paper, destroy the black ink. All the color ink gets used with the black ink. My dad gets home from work and he's like, I'm trying to print something for the taxes and I can't print it. What happened to the printer? I just bought ink last week. Like, sorry. He's like, do you have any idea how much ink cartridges cost? Jesus, kids, what are you doing? Right? Just ravaged the family's entire budget because you had to print out like Cloud Fan 469's gigantic epic guide to Final Fantasy VII, where he just calls out the Prima guide in like 7 different spots. He's like, this is wrong in the Prima guide. What you actually want to do is this, and so on and so on and so on. Like, just such an era, right? Such an incredibly weird combination of events, by the way. How bizarre is this that I have the official guide and then I'm printing out the entire unofficial guide because it's like more accurate? I don't remember if I did that. No, we must have done that for a game. Like, we must have had the official and then printed out the community guide because we got frustrated with the official one. And then, like, as a kid, my brothers are like, oh, go print out this part of the guide. And then I just print out the entire guide, right? Because I'm like, oh, I don't know how to do page numbers. I'm 7. What do you want from me? I'm getting so far off track here, but, like, it's one of those little bits of nostalgia that I run into and I just have to indulge it. So these strategy guides for old JRPGs, right? You end up following them in a step-by-step line. There's the official versus the non-official, the community stuff always being a little better. And then they have the misinformation stuff. Now, there's one weird element that I really want to point out with these guides that I think is absolutely essential for the analogy between this and game development, right? If you're following one of these guides and you're not following it to the letter, there are sometimes points in the guide where they're like, well, luckily you already have this item, right? Luckily you already have ribbon because you've been following this guide, so you'll have no problem with this boss. And you're like, I didn't get that item. I started following this guide at page like 60, and you explained how to get ribbon at like page 40, so I didn't get that secret. And then they're like, oh, and if you don't have that secret, then here's another extremely weird solution to this boss that is like just the worst, grindiest thing, right? They give you this other solution. And in case I forget to mention it later, which I'm going to try very hard not to, I want you to think about how that relates to video game development tutorials. I just want you to put just a little thought in the back of your head. I just want to plant that seed where you go, what if I just want to pull a little information from the tutorial that's like 20 minutes deep in the tutorial? Sometimes you just don't have the right context. Sometimes it completely screws you. And we won't dig into that right now, but it's worth thinking about. Let's talk about a different form of guide. So we've talked about the JRPG guides. What about a more complex game? Something where you're not just following it for secrets, but you're following it for like knowledge, like meta-level knowledge. You're looking at like a League of Legends build guide. You're looking at a Path of Exile build guide because those games are crazy. Path of Exile is like, you need to write a dissertation in order to learn how to build your character. The first time I tried to play that game, I got like hard stuck at like level 25 because I was focused on a very specific build structure and I just like had no survivability whatsoever. I tried to figure it out on my own. God forbid you try to figure out the game on your own, right? So these guides have a different issue. These guides are not telling you how to do every single step of the game. Not at all. They're saying, here's what you want to do. Put your stats into this. Put your stats into that. That's cool. That's great. That's handy. It's like a tips and tricks thing. You look at it, you go, okay, cool. Now I know exactly what to do. But you don't learn the underlying principles from these guides, which is really frustrating for me. And when they try to explain it, it's like overcomplicated explanations. And there's this whole vibe of the guide. There's this whole feeling that is, just trust me. This is the way to do it. Just go with it. And you use this guide, and then you start playing the game, and you're like, why isn't this working? Oh, it turns out that guide was from before the hot fix, and now the hot fix has happened, so this is no longer overpowered, so now it's got to be this thing. And every single one of these guides says it's the best class, and it's the best build you've ever seen, and it's so perfect, and blah, 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 blah. But you play these builds, and you also don't get to take the pride in it. There's like this element that you lose again, and it drives me crazy. Because it's like I have to use one of these build guides for some of these games in order to get to a certain point, right? Or I have to dedicate hundreds of hours of focus to learning how to build this freaking character, to just figuring out how to play this game. And like, I'm not going to do that for a game. Like, I want to play the game. I'm not going to spend hundreds of hours understanding the intense stat distributions that are like one guy who made the game has an actual full understanding of it, right? Like, and there's all these weird subtle mechanics in a game like Path of Exile, where it's like, oh, life leech is different than life on hit. And when you're first playing with that, you have no idea. Then as you dig deeper, you go, oh, life leech is completely different from life on hit. And that's like going through Godot and being like, oh, this way of using signals is completely different than this way. Or like, that's maybe not the best analogy, but there are a million different things in programming that are like, oh, no, actually, you want to do it this way, not that way, because of extremely subtle reasons. I'm okay with that in programming because there's a really good reason for it. And honestly, I'm kind of okay with it in Path of Exile because I freaking love Path of Exile. And it's an extremely interesting and fun and complicated game. But there is something about following these guides that feels like, yeah, but how do I actually learn the information? How do I actually learn how to build a character? How do you learn to build a Path of Exile character? What does that process look like? It's not just from reading about it. You know, I haven't done that. I haven't experienced that process because the first time I did it, I bombed, fell flat on my face, and went, okay, well, I'm just going to follow guides forever now. I'm just going to, like, I guess I tried to build things, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, but I was always roughly following some kind of a guide. But, like, building an optimal PoE character is, like, that's a wild journey. That can't be easy to really learn. Like, to get the late game stuff, like, the really late game stuff, I don't know. That's got to take so much like digesting of the information behind the game. Same thing for something like League of Legends. For a game like even like Warcraft 3, like build guides, like build orders, I should say. And this is the other side. This is the final angle on guides that I really want to talk about, and how they relate to game development this might be the most obvious one, or maybe not. It feels like the most obvious one to me. If you were playing a game like Warcraft 3, if you were playing a game that is profoundly skill-based, maybe you're playing a shooter that has some builds behind it, maybe you're playing League of Legends, and you read a guide, it can and will tell you exactly what you need to do. It can and will tell you this information. It'll say, build this many things by 2 minutes, do it in exactly this order. It's going to be a little tricky. And then you can try to do it, and you will get wrecked. You will get absolutely destroyed. But it's giving you exactly the information that you need in order to execute this thing in such a precise and clean way. And honestly, this is my favorite kind of guide because you learn this information and you can do it, you can execute it, and you can get to understand it pretty well. You get to understand at least the process of executing it. You may not understand the meta information. You may not understand the thought process behind it, the design of the build order in the case of a war strategy, but you can experience it. You can start to get a feel for it. And then if you want to experiment, you build off of it. It's a template. it's a framework, right? It's something you build around, and then it's like a checklist almost. It's just, you want to hit this number by this point, and then if your enemy is doing this other thing, you might want to do this number by this point. Those are brilliant, but they're not very useful, right? They're extremely useful, but they're also like, great, thanks. Thanks for telling me that the trick to climbing this wall is to climb to the top of the wall. Thank you for telling me that I just need to get good. Oh, build this many Zerglings by this many minutes, and the trick is to build this pool by this. It feels impossible. You start trying to do it, and you're like, I don't know how many hands this person has and how many eyes they have that they're able to do this while also not getting wrecked by the enemy in the first 5 minutes. Like, what is going on? How skilled is this person? But then you see that it's possible and you start developing the skills. Those are maybe my favorite video game guides because they give you the most actionable path for learning something, right? And while they may not be helping you learn the deeper core idea, they're helping you learn something that gives you experience with the core mechanics of the game so that you can then progress in a more meaningful way. Does that make sense? This might be a very debatable point, but I do think that there's a much higher value in a guide that says, hey, here are the basics. It's gonna be hard, and you're gonna have to figure out how to get this, how to accomplish these tasks. But here are the tasks, and here are some basic tips. That stuff is incredible for me. It's like, oh, here's the items you want by this point in League of Legends. By the way, you don't have enough gold because you suck at last hitting, so you need to learn how to last hit. Or like, oh, by the way, you keep getting ganked, so you got to keep watching the map, right? You start seeing the obstacles very clearly when you have these goals, and you start going, why am I not hitting these goals? Oh, because this is getting in my way. I guess I have to solve that. And no guide in the world can solve that problem for you. Now we get to the really juicy stuff. And what's fun about this is you can draw connections with this to basically any creative field. You want to connect this to music? Done. You want to connect this to art? Done. But we're going to talk about game development. Every single flaw and strength of video game guides, I believe, applies in some level to game development tutorials and educational materials, right? You have versions of the development guide that are a step-by-step, line-by-line thing that you do not retain well. But if you want to go back to it, you can follow it line by line again. And then if you try to just read the whole thing and then execute it, it's like too detailed to execute, and you can maybe get a vague idea. The official versions of it are often worse than the community versions because they're out of date and they have to go through this whole bureaucratic process. The mismatch that you have between your experience and the guide, if you decide to stray on your own, can be a little catastrophic. So oftentimes, if I'm following a guide for game development, that's like a step-by-step, line-by-line thing, what I would do, back when I was taking the GameDev.tv course, which was a good one, by the way, the 2D Unity course is good, because they teach you how to use it very effectively. So what I would do when I was using that course is I would go through and I would go ahead of them. The moment that I got an inkling of what they were going to tell me to do, I stopped it. I did that however I was going to do it. I tried to push it a little further, and I was like, okay, that's my angle. That's how I'm going to do this. What do you have to say? And then I would go back, listen to it, and go, oh, they're doing it completely differently. And then I would assess the way they did it and the way that I did it, and I would decide whether or not I wanted to switch to the way that they did it, because sometimes I was like, I like my version, and I'm going to keep letting it ride with this. Did that ever bite me in the butt? Yes, it did, but I learned a lot from it. So it's got that flaw too of like, if you're following every single thing, you're going to have no problems whatsoever. If you pivot a little bit, you're going to have to learn some other stuff, but that might be good for you and it might make you enjoy the experience more. This line by line thing gives you no feeling of real accomplishment as you're like doing it. Does that make sense? I think you can fool yourself with it though. You can go, I beat the game, you know? You can go, I finished making this thing. And you did. And that's really cool. And what did you learn from it? You know? Because if you learned a bunch from it, then you crushed it. It's amazing. It's fantastic. If you followed exactly line by line something that tells you everything to do and followed along as it was saying what to do, you followed a recipe and you don't understand it. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? And I don't say this to be discouraging. I say this to encourage people to digest guides and tutorials in a way that is genuinely useful and does not lead you to deceive yourself into thinking you have skills that you have not actually developed or internalized. Just because you've done something once doesn't mean you understand how to do it and how to apply the knowledge in different contexts, right? Now, let's talk about these mechanical guides a little bit. The just trust me thing is a problem for me. When a game guide has a just trust me aesthetic to it, I don't want to follow it. For other people, it might be completely fine. In programming, if something is just do it this way, I go, I don't want to do it. I want to understand why. I want to learn why. I need to understand why this works. And that problem absolutely exists, mainly because there's just a ton of information out there where people think you already know how it works and you just don't know how it works. I think it's the same thing, honestly, between games and game development. Oh, everybody knows how this works. It's like nobody has any idea how that works, man. You gotta explain or teach me how to learn it. You gotta show me how you learned this, right? And then they just use complicated terminology that you don't understand, you know? Same thing as in game guides. They're just like, oh, the this of the that. I don't know how to explain it in game guides, but sometimes there are just these weird game-specific acronyms and terms and things. Like, think about the DPS. For somebody who's never played games before and they see, like, the DPS of the Necro is magnified by its combination with the skills of the whatever. Like, it just gets baffling for somebody who has never touched a game before. They will have no idea. They'll be like, Necro, what is Necro? And you're like, Necromancer. And then you go, oh, okay, what is DPS? Like, you have to go through it and explain these things. It's the same thing with programming. There are so many terms that the people creating these guides think everybody understands, and we have no clue, right? At least if you're just starting out. And the last bit is my favorite type of guide. The skill-based guide is just frustrating to interact with, and it's not that appealing because in a game like Warcraft 3, that's kind of the only thing that exists. In something like programming, that's not the only thing that exists, not even remotely. There's a million guides that will tell you exactly what to do. They'll just hold your hand the whole way through. It's a lot harder to really engage with a guide that says, hey, you're going to have no idea what you're doing, but these are the things you need to hit. These are the goals you need to hit. So just try to figure it out, right? And structuring that guide is a lot more difficult when there's so many variables. but I think that there's a real value in the guide that says, hey, here are some basic tools, here are some basic hints, here are some obstacles you're going to run into and some basic hints about that. Move forward from here. That's one of the reasons I like the GameDev.tv 2D Unity guide or tutorial, course, whatever you want to call it, because it gives you all these checkpoints and it says, hey, do this now. Hey, try to figure this out. Hey, try and figure this out. We know it's challenging. Give it a shot. It is the most well-made how to learn game development guide that I've interacted with. It was very well structured to make you go, oh, okay, this is a good process for figuring stuff out. And so even though I'm not a Unity guy, even though I don't use Unity anymore, I do encourage people to check out that specific course and get it for cheap, by the way. It needs to be on sale. Having said all of that, that's just a rundown, just connecting all of these things from the beginning to this portion. Every weakness and every strength, they all exist. So we got to lean on the strengths and we got to avoid the weaknesses. We don't want to do, at least for me, everybody's going to have their own angle, but I don't want to do a line-by-line following of game development tutorials. I can't do it. It drives me crazy. It does not work for me. I do absolutely want some help, though. I do absolutely want to go into a guide and go, hey, there are like 374 terms that I've never heard in my entire life. Could you tell me which one I should be figuring out right now? Because that's a lot of terms. And I aspire to one day be able to provide this kind of assistance to people because I think that on some level I have an understanding of it that could be valuable. So I'd like to work towards that one day. Don't hold out for it. If you're hearing that and going, "Oh, that's great. I can't wait for that." Hold on. It's going to be a while, right? If I ever get to it. But this idea of guides that just say, "Hey, move in this direction. This is a good direction. Here's a couple of stumbling blocks you're going to run into. Get after that." I think that's the good stuff. I think that's really where the juice is. And I am going to start experimenting with that a little bit, by the way. I'll mess with like some YouTube shorts and stuff and see if I can't figure out a formula for that works in like a way that is small enough that I can actually produce it. But anyway, I digress. Let's lock in on this a little bit. I think focusing on memorizing stuff is a deep flaw in development tutorials. I think there's this urge to try to memorize stuff in order to understand it, and I think focusing on skill development instead is really powerful. Treating game development tutorials not as a walkthrough, but as a skill guide. I don't know how else to put that. A skill development guide. As gamers, we look at it and we go, "Oh, this is a walkthrough." It's not a walkthrough. It's just not a walkthrough. And sometimes they're completely necessary and sometimes they're extremely useful, but we just have to remember that the walkthrough is not that good for developing skills. And maybe you are completely different from me with this. That's the other angle of this. Maybe they work perfectly for you. Maybe they're incredible and this is just one perspective. You might be hearing my perspective and going, "What the heck? What is he talking about? I learn so well from walkthroughs. I get so much out of them." Well, now you've seen that some people don't, to the point that I think that it's just straight up not a good way to learn. Like, I believe so firmly that walkthroughs are an ineffective way to learn that I'm saying it almost as a universal sweeping statement. So that is how different my perspective is from your perspective. If you are somebody who believes that walkthroughs are extremely useful to learn from. And I would encourage you to try my angle if you never have. And I should try to understand where you're coming from because I don't understand it. Whenever I use a walkthrough, I just don't digest it at all. I understand it 0%, like 2% maybe, you know? Also, there's a danger of horribly inaccurate guides. Like we mentioned. There's a danger of guides that are just like completely wrong because they're out of date because they're from Godot 3.2 or whatever, and we're on like 4.3 now, right? And then there's the danger of ignoring part of a guide and then following a different part of it and going, "Okay, I'm trying to extract this information from it," and then finding out that it's reliant on previous information in the guide. So like it can be tricky extracting information from a guide. And I think it's important to notice these little stumbling blocks and go, "Oh, wait, okay, can I actually pull this and apply it to my game?" And like we have a way of applying this stuff. We have a way of pulling from a guide, pulling from a game development tutorial and digesting it and learning what we need to learn. And that's a skill that has to be developed for sure. But I think that is ultimately one of the best ways to interact with all these different tutorials that are out there, because it's like, nobody knows your exact use case. Even if you've explained your exact use case to other people, as I often have on my Twitch stream, even if you've explained your exact use case, you probably haven't explained it perfectly and they're not in your head, right? The only way to perfectly communicate your use case is to make it the way you want it to be. And then people will see what your use case was. And then you'll be able to look at it and go, "Oh yeah, okay, this could have been better." I want to make one final point in this section before we wrap things up. I know I've been going on and on about this one, but I'm passionate about this. It's education adjacent. My background's in education, so I kind of dive deep on this stuff and get a little rambly and a little passionate. So thank you for bearing with me. a final note, which is about useless teachers. All right? Useless guides, useless walkthroughs, the stuff that is just completely misleading and bad. Useless walkthroughs generally sink to the bottom immediately, right? You look at a walkthrough for a game, it's completely useless. You find out instantly. You don't have to deal with it. It quickly proves itself to not be useful. You start using it and you go, this is obviously wrong. It might deceive you for a little bit, but you reach a point where it says something is here and you look and it's not there. And you might gaslight yourself for a couple minutes and be like, no, I must be wrong. I must be wrong. I must be wrong. But pretty quickly you get to a point with a walkthrough where you go, it's freaking wrong. This walkthrough is bad. And I just know. And it's easy to assess. It's not as easy to assess a useless or bad or misleading development tool, teacher, course, tutorial, whatever. It's not as hard, or it's not as, how do I put this? It's also not that easy to assess a really bad, like high-level mechanical video game guide, right? That's a lot harder to assess. In the same way, it's really, when something is really freaking useless, but really, really complicated in its presentation, you can fall into the trap and you can waste so much time going, why am I not getting this? Why don't I get this? Why don't I understand this? I still can't understand this. This is so difficult. It might be being presented horribly to you. You might need a different presentation. You might need a different resource. And honestly, look, as somebody with a background in education, I hate to acknowledge this fact, but it is a fact. Sometimes a teacher is useless to you. Sometimes a tutorial is useless to you. Sometimes it does not fit the way that you learn. More often than not, it's just bad material. And that happens. It happens. Don't blame yourself always when something isn't working for you. Don't do this thing where you just go, oh, I just don't get it. I just can't understand how to develop games. It's so difficult. Or maybe you're following a JRPG guide when you should be following a skill-based guide. You know? Or maybe you're reading a guide that you don't understand any of the terminology of. Maybe the person who's teaching you doesn't know how to communicate to you specifically because they're trying to communicate to an entirely different audience that has a completely different background than you. And maybe you just need to find a different resource. It's okay to go, I have no idea what you're saying, and this may just not be the right teacher for me. This may not be the right guide for me. This may not be the correct angle of approach. Maybe you learn weird, by the way. Maybe your way of learning is totally different from everything that everybody has ever presented to you throughout your life. That can happen. Now, don't assume that. Don't go, I am bad at this. I just learn stupid. I can't learn. Everything is broken and I'll never make any progress. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is maybe there's a better way for you to learn something. And it's okay to explore those ideas. Don't be a freaking doomer about it, right? Don't get all like, oh, I'm doomed because I learned different. No, I'm saying this is a hopeful thing. If you're getting stuck in weird ways and you keep trying the same solution, try a different angle to learn something. And don't assume that you're right. Just try it. Just explore it. Just say, what if I challenge myself from this angle instead of that angle? What if instead of focusing on digesting all of this stuff that somebody is saying and like learning this vocabulary and memorizing these steps and following line by line, what if instead I look at some fundamental thing that they keep mentioning and I just play with that? They're like, oh, this is how you make a character move. First, download this, how how do I put this? First, like write these 5 lines of code or whatever. What if you just start playing with those 5 lines of code, right? What if you just start going, oh, what if I change this element? What if I change that element? What if you just get a little bit of playful experience with the tools? Play the game of game development is what I'm getting at. Stop being so hooked on the walkthrough, so addicted to this freaking walkthrough and this guide. And like, I have to do exactly what these people are telling me to, otherwise I'm doomed to failure and it's going to be a disaster and I'll never succeed and blah, 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 blah. No. Play the game of game development, learn the mechanics, get to know it, enjoy it. Have a good time making games. Stop trying to follow a strategy that may not be working for you. And I say this because I've absolutely done that before, and it drives me crazy the amount of time that I've wasted attempting to do things in a way that is just not helping me digest the information. I hope that's useful to you. I recognize I've gone on a bit of a weird tangent there, but I hope it's of some use to you. For those of you who are just getting started, just trying to learn this stuff and are so locked into like tutorial hell. I don't know how else to explain these concepts, but I'm going to keep trying. If I run into good ideas around it, I'll put something out there for it. All right. Let's wrap things up. Let's give you a couple questions to get you thinking for the week and get you inspired. Couple quick questions for you. First one is, what are the best experiences that you've had with a guide or a walkthrough or even a teacher? What are the things that really worked for you, that really helped you learn or helped you enjoy the game? Was it a guide that walked you line by line? If so, great. Go with that. Was it something that gave you a challenge and invited you to interact with that challenge in a very open way? And was this an environment that really worked for you? Is it similar to the game development environment? Does it apply? Can it apply? Or are we just trying to mix things a little too much? For me, some of my best guide experiences, like gameplay guides, that's going to be Warcraft 3. I just had so much fun playing Warcraft 3 and trying to figure it out and asking other players for a couple tips and like doing like matches with other players. And I remember just like asking people to teach me to play the game in like chat rooms in Warcraft 3. And it was weird. It was a strange approach for sure, but eventually I found somebody who was like willing to show me the ropes a little bit and like go up against me and like just do some sample games and point out some mistakes and stuff, like literally like basically one-on-one mentoring growth thing. I think that can be huge. Just like individualized interaction can be massive. Same thing, music education, like learning music. Some of the most important lessons I've learned were through just one-on-one lessons with a teacher. We don't always have that luxury, of course. So outside of that, there's I've had good experiences with guides where I can consume a chunk and then challenge myself a bunch, like that game dev 2D Unity guide, gamedev.tv 2D Unity guide was good. Next question. What are your worst guide experiences? Ironically, also one-on-one mentoring. It's a real hit or miss situation. For me, one-on-one mentoring in the education side of things has been one of my worst like guide or learning experiences for sure. Now, what about in video games? What about for you? What have you had in a game that has had you really like, this is terrible. This is not helping me at all. For me, it's going line by line, and in game dev too, line by line guide stuff drives me crazy. Does not work for me. Or things that are overly detailed breakdowns that are like, you must hit this checkpoint before you move to this next checkpoint. This exists a lot in music. I have a lot of trouble with hit this checkpoint before you proceed, or like things that sound like you have to master this before you go to this, because I go, what is the definition of mastery? And then I spend the remainder of my life trying to learn a single scale because I'm like, well, that's not mastery. if I don't have a real clear checkpoint, like if it's not like this is exactly when you're allowed to move forward, then I just go, okay, so I'm allowed to move forward when I'm the greatest in the world at this one specific skill. Okay, hold on. Give me the rest of my life real quick, and then I'll get there. That's a quirk of my personality, and it gets in the way. Well, what are the worst guide experiences for you? What are the quirks of your personality that get in the way of you learning something or experiencing a game in a fun way? Because, by the way, this can all just apply to having fun in a game. It doesn't have to be about game development and learning things. And then, what did I write here? I have one more note. It says, same questions. Oh, I already said it. I already covered it. I had a note that said same question, but with teachers/mentors. So you can split those questions up. It's like worst guide, worst teacher, best teacher. Feel free to split it into 4 questions if you like. That is everything for this week. Thank you for sticking with me for this extra long jumbo episode. I was passionate. I was diving in. I was excited. And I hope that you enjoyed it. And I'll see you next week. We've got the Twitch stream. We got Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to start making YouTube shorts. I've already made the first one. We'll see. I might even post it today. We'll see. And it's not education stuff yet. I might start making some educational content. But I want to make sure that if I do, it is high quality. I want to make sure that it is simple and useful. Right? So that's a little tricky to do. That's a hard thing to execute for sure. So I might start doing that. You can look forward to that too. That will be on YouTube if I do that for sure. That's everything. We've got Discord if you want to hang out with the community. Blah, 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 blah. There you go. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, get out there, make some stuff, and have fun with it. See ya.